Hello everyone and welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for joining us. If you're new here, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories for more mysterious tales and unexplained phenomena. Now, settle in as we explore the strange case of Graham Ellison and the lights over Cape Fear River. January 8th, 2007. The morning mist clung to the Cape Fear River like a shroud, and Graham Ellison couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the tree line. He'd been coming to this same fishing spot for 15 years, ever since moving to Fayetteville, but today felt different. The air itself seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't name. "Dad, you're holding the rod wrong," his 16-year-old son Tyler said, casting his line with the practiced ease of someone who'd grown up on these waters. "You're distracted today." Graham adjusted his grip and tried to focus on the familiar rhythm of the river. The sun was climbing higher, burning off the early morning fog, and normally this would be his favourite time of day. But something nagged at him, a persistent itch in the back of his mind that he couldn't scratch. "Just tired, son. Long week at the construction site." Tyler nodded and settled back against a fallen log, his attention fixed on the water. Graham envied his son's ability to be present in the moment. At 45, Graham felt like he was always looking over his shoulder, always waiting for the next crisis or deadline. Building houses in North Carolina's volatile economy meant constant stress, but fishing usually helped him decompress. Today, however, the river seemed to be holding its breath. The first light appeared at 3:47 p.m, according to Tyler's watch. Later, they would both remember this detail with crystalline clarity, though neither could explain why they'd been so compelled to check the time at that exact moment. It started as a distant glow, like sunlight reflecting off an airplane's wing. Graham squinted against the afternoon sun, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The light pulsed once, twice, then split into 3 distinct orbs that hung motionless above the far shore. "Dad!" Tyler's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you seeing this?" Graham's mouth had gone dry. The orbs were beautiful and terrifying, each one roughly the size of a car, glowing with an inner light that seemed to shift between gold and silver. They moved with purpose, forming a perfect triangle that slowly began to rotate. "What do you think they are?" Tyler asked, his teenage bravado completely absent. Before Graham could answer, the orbs began to move toward them. Not quickly, but with the inevitable certainty of a tide coming in. The air around them seemed to thicken, and Graham felt a strange tingling in his extremities, like the moment before lightning strikes. The next thing he remembered was waking up on the riverbank with Tyler shaking his shoulder. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Hours had passed, though it felt like mere minutes. "Dad, we need to go," Tyler said, his voice tight with fear. "Something's not right." Graham sat up slowly, his head spinning. The fishing gear was exactly where they'd left it, their cooler still packed with sandwiches and cold drinks. But something fundamental had changed. The world looked the same, but it felt different, like a familiar song played in a different key. "What happened?" Graham asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "I don't know," Tyler said. "One minute we were watching those lights, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up and you were unconscious. Dad, we've been here for almost 6 hours." As they packed up their gear, Graham kept glancing at the sky, expecting to see the orbs return. But the heavens remained empty, offering no explanation for their lost time, or the strange sense of anticipation that had settled in his chest like a weight. That night, Graham dreamed of a woman made of starlight standing by the river. She didn't speak, but somehow he understood that she was trying to tell him something important. When he woke, he found himself drawing symbols he'd never seen before, geometric patterns that seemed to flow from his hand without conscious thought. Tyler never spoke about that day again, but Graham noticed his son watching the sky with new intensity, as if waiting for something to return. 3 days later, Graham posted his experience on a local UFO forum, describing the lights and the missing time. He used a pseudonym and kept the details vague, but the response was immediate and unsettling. Within hours, his post had been viewed hundreds of times and generated dozens of responses from people claiming similar experiences. What Graham didn't know was that his post had also been flagged by automated systems monitoring internet traffic for specific keywords. In a windowless office in Virginia, a junior analyst highlighted Graham's account and forwarded it to a supervisor with a note: "Possible Class C encounter. Recommend monitoring." The wheels of a vast machinery had begun to turn, and Graham Ellison was about to discover that some experiences are too significant to remain private. Spring 2007. The first sign that Graham's life was about to change came on a Tuesday morning in March. He was reviewing blueprints for a new subdivision when he noticed a black SUV parked across from his office. The windows were tinted dark enough to hide the occupants, and the license plate was generic government issue. Graham had served 2 tours in Iraq before settling into civilian life, and his military instincts were still sharp. The SUV's positioning gave its occupants a clear view of both his office and his home. This wasn't a coincidence. By Thursday there were 2 vehicles rotating in shifts. Professional surveillance, discreet but not invisible. Graham began taking different routes home, checking his rearview mirror, and noting the faces of strangers who lingered too long in his neighbourhood. The direct approach came on a Friday evening. Graham was working late when 2 men in unremarkable suits entered his office. One was tall and thin with prematurely grey hair, the other shorter and stockier, with the kind of tan that came from desk work under fluorescent lights. "Mr. Ellison," tall one said, "I'm Dr. Michael Stevens, and this is my colleague Dr. James Park. We're researchers from the Environmental Protection Agency. We understand you had an unusual experience near the Cape Fear River in January." Graham's hand moved instinctively toward the drawer where he kept a loaded pistol. "I never mentioned anything to the EPA. Internet forums are public record," Dr. Park said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your post was quite detailed. We're part of a task force investigating unusual environmental phenomena in the region. There have been several reports of unexplained lights and electromagnetic anomalies." "I see." Graham kept his voice neutral. "And you want to know what I saw?" "We'd like to study the area where you had your experience," Dr. Stevens said. "With your permission, of course. We'd like to take soil samples, check for radiation levels, that sort of thing. Purely scientific." Graham studied their faces. Both men had the look of people who spent their lives in offices and conference rooms, but there was something else there too. A hunger, an intensity that didn't match their bureaucratic cover story. "What kind of environmental phenomena?" he asked. "Magnetic anomalies mostly," Dr. Park said. "Solar flare activity can sometimes create unusual atmospheric effects. We're trying to determine if there's a pattern." It was a reasonable explanation, but Graham's instincts were screaming that these men were lying. Still, he found himself nodding. "I suppose that would be all right. When did you want to do this?" "Tomorrow morning, if possible. We won't disturb your property, just the riverbank area where you reported the sighting." After they left, Graham sat in his office for a long time, staring at the business card Doctor Stevens had given him. The EPA logo looked authentic, but the phone number went to a generic voicemail system. He tried calling the main EPA office and asking for Dr. Stevens, but was told no one by that name worked there. The next morning, Graham drove to the river to watch the researchers work. They arrived in a white van loaded with equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything the EPA would use for a routine environmental survey. Both men wore hazmat suits and carried devices that beeped and clicked as they moved around the area. "Finding anything interesting?" Graham asked. Dr. Stevens looked up from a tablet displaying what appeared to be wavelength readings. Some elevated electromagnetic activity, but nothing dangerous. The soil composition is unusual, though. Higher than normal levels of rare earth elements. "What does that mean?" "Probably nothing," Dr. Park said. "Could be natural deposits or runoff from industrial activity upstream." They worked for 3 hours, taking samples and recording measurements. Before leaving, Dr. Stevens approached Graham with a small device about the size of a smartphone. "We'd like to leave this sensor here for a few days," he said. "It'll monitor electromagnetic fluctuations and help us build a baseline for the area. Is that all right?" Graham took the device and examined it. It was heavier than it looked, with a small LED that pulsed blue every few seconds. "How long do you need it?" "A week, maybe 2. We'll come back to collect it." After they left, Graham clipped the sensor to a tree branch near the spot where he'd seen the lights. It seemed harmless enough, but that night he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. 3 days later, his neighbour's dog started acting strangely. The normally friendly retriever would bark frantically whenever it got near the sensor, and refused to go anywhere near the river. Graham's own sleep became restless, filled with dreams of the Starlight Woman and geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. On the 4th night, Graham woke to find the sensor glowing brighter than usual. He walked to his window and saw that it was emitting a steady beam of light toward the sky. When he went outside to investigate, the device fell silent and dark the moment he approached. The next morning, Graham examined the sensor more carefully. Hidden beneath its official-looking casing, he found a small label, property of Halford Dynamics, Classified Research Division. A quick internet search revealed that Halford Dynamics was a defence contractor specialising in aerospace technology and electronic surveillance. They had major contracts with the Pentagon and several 3-letter agencies. Graham carefully removed the sensor from the tree and drove to the public library, where he used one of their computers to research Halford Dynamics more thoroughly. What he found made his blood run cold. The company had been involved in several black projects related to exotic propulsion systems, and what their website euphemistically called consciousness interface technology. There were references to contracts with the Defense Intelligence Agency and something called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. When Graham returned home, he found the sensor exactly where he'd left it, clipped to the same branch. He was certain he'd taken it with him, but there it was, pulsing its blue light as if nothing had happened. That night he dreamed of the Starlight Woman again. This time she spoke. "They're listening," she said in a voice like wind through leaves, "but they don't understand what they're hearing. Be careful, Graham. The beacon has been lit, and they will come." When he woke, Graham found fresh symbols drawn on the notepad beside his bed. His hand was stained with ink, though he had no memory of drawing anything. The symbols looked like a warning. September 2007. Rowan Knox had been investigating government secrecy for 12 years, but she'd never encountered a case quite like Graham Ellison's. The freelance journalist had built her reputation on meticulous research and an almost supernatural ability to navigate the labyrinthine world of classified documents and redacted files. Her interest in the Ellison case began with a routine Freedom of Information Act request. She'd been researching electromagnetic anomalies in North Carolina for an article about environmental cover-ups when Graham's name appeared in a Defense Intelligence Agency database titled Anomalous Human Contact Events, Classification Restricted. The file was heavily redacted, but what remained was tantalizing. References to biological harmonics, message-receptive conditions, and something called Project Threshold. Most intriguingly, there were multiple references to a beacon subject, whose neurological patterns indicate enhanced sensitivity to non-terrestrial communications. Rowan had seen enough government documents to recognise the language of black projects. This wasn't environmental research or weather phenomena. This was something far more exotic. She began with public records, tracing Graham's military service, his business dealings, and his family history. On paper, he was exactly what he appeared to be, a working-class veteran who'd built a modest construction business and raised 4 children in rural North Carolina. But the government's interest in him suggested there was more to the story. The breakthrough came when she interviewed Dr. Sarah Chen, a former Pentagon researcher who'd left government service after becoming disillusioned with the military's approach to unexplained phenomena. They met at a coffee shop in Arlington, Virginia, where Chen spoke in careful, measured tones about her work on something called the Consciousness Interface Project. "We were studying people who claimed to have had contact with unexplained intelligences," Chen explained. "Not abduction cases, but something more subtle. People who reported receiving information through dreams, visions, or direct mental contact. Information about what? Future events, mostly. Technological developments, environmental changes, sometimes geopolitical shifts. The accuracy rate was surprisingly high, but the subjects were often dismissed as delusional or attention-seeking," Rowan leaned forward. "What made them different?" "Neurological anomalies," Chen said. "Specific patterns in their brain activity that we couldn't explain. It was as if their consciousness was operating on a different frequency than normal humans. And Graham Ellison? Chen's expression grew guarded. I can't discuss specific cases, but I will say that some subjects were more receptive than others. A few seemed to be in direct communication with intelligences that demonstrated knowledge beyond current human understanding. What happened to the project? It was transferred to a different agency, above my clearance level, but I heard rumours that it became part of something larger, something that involved monitoring these individuals indefinitely. After the interview, Rowan spent weeks trying to verify Chen's claims. She contacted other former government researchers, many of whom refused to speak on the record. But gradually, a picture emerged of a secret program that had been studying human consciousness and its potential for contact with non-human intelligence. The program had multiple names over the years: Project Threshold, the Consciousness Interface Project, and most recently something called the Observer Initiative. The common thread was the identification and monitoring of individuals who displayed unusual sensitivity to what the documents euphemistically called anomalous information sources. Rowan's investigation led her to a small community of researchers and experiencers who communicated through encrypted forums and private conferences. They called themselves the Network, and they were united by a shared belief that the government was actively suppressing evidence of non-human intelligence. Through the network, Rowan learned that Graham Ellison wasn't alone. There were dozens of similar cases scattered across the country, all involving individuals who'd had contact with unexplained lights or entities and subsequently found themselves under government surveillance. The pattern was always the same: initial contact with anomalous phenomena, followed by a period of enhanced psychic sensitivity, then the arrival of government researchers claiming to study environmental or psychological effects. The subjects were never arrested or directly threatened, but their lives were quietly monitored and their activities tracked. "They're not trying to silence us," one experiencer told Rowan during an encrypted phone call. "They're studying us, like lab rats." Studying you for what? To understand how the contact works. They want to know how to communicate with them directly, without needing people like us as intermediaries. The pieces began to fall into place. The government wasn't covering up evidence of non-human intelligence. They were trying to weaponize it. The experiencers weren't being silenced. They were being used as unwitting research subjects in a program designed to establish direct communication with entities that seemed to exist outside normal human understanding. Rowan's investigation took on new urgency when she discovered that Graham Ellison's case was considered particularly significant. Unlike other experiencers who reported sporadic contact or vague impressions, Graham appeared to be in ongoing communication with what the files referred to as the primary source. The document suggested that Graham was receiving specific information about future events, and that this information had proven remarkably accurate. One heavily redacted memo mentioned prophetic accuracy rates exceeding 85%, and recommended immediate escalation to Umbra clearance levels. Rowan had never heard of Umbra clearance, but her sources suggested it was reserved for the most sensitive intelligence operations. Whatever Graham Ellison was experiencing, it had attracted the attention of the highest levels of the intelligence community. The journalist's investigation was interrupted when she returned to her apartment one evening to find her door slightly ajar. Nothing had been stolen, but her research materials had been carefully examined and photographed. On her desk she found a single business card with no name or title, just a phone number and the words, "We should talk." When she called the number, a man with a slight southern accent answered on the first ring. "Ms. Knox," he said, "I believe you've been asking questions about Graham Ellison. Who is this?" "Someone who shares your interest in the truth. But I should warn you, the truth about Mr. Ellison is more complicated than you realise. There are forces at work that go beyond simple government surveillance." "What kind of forces?" "The kind that have been watching humanity for a very long time, and they're becoming more active. Mr. Ellison is just the beginning." The line went dead, leaving Rowan staring at her phone and wondering if she'd stumbled onto something far more significant than she'd imagined. Over the following weeks, she noticed signs of surveillance around her own apartment. Black SUVs with tinted windows, strangers who seemed to be photographing her building, electronic interference with her phone and computer. She was being watched, just like Graham Ellison. But unlike Graham, Rowan had no contact with mysterious entities or prophetic visions. She was simply a journalist asking inconvenient questions, which meant that the government's interest in her case was sending a different message. They were serious about protecting their secret, and they were willing to intimidate anyone who got too close to the truth. Rowan realised that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Her investigation had evolved from a simple story about government secrecy to something that threatened to expose one of the most closely guarded secrets in human history. The question was, what was she going to do about it? December 2007. Dr. Elias Wren had spent his entire career searching for the intersection between consciousness and quantum mechanics, but he'd never expected to find it in a government file marked Classified Eyes Only. The physicist had been recruited from his position at MIT 3 months earlier, ostensibly to consult on exotic propulsion systems for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The reality was far more intriguing. Wren's real assignment was to evaluate the scientific implications of Project Threshold, a classified program that had been monitoring individuals with apparent psychic abilities since the 1970s. The project had produced thousands of pages of documentation, but very little in the way of concrete results, until Graham Ellison. The Ellison file occupied an entire cabinet in the secure facility where Wren worked, a nondescript office building in Langley, Virginia. The case was unique in the history of the project. An ordinary civilian who'd experienced contact with unknown intelligences and subsequently demonstrated abilities that defied conventional understanding of human consciousness. What makes this case different? Wren asked his supervisor, Major Lyle Granger, during their first briefing. Granger was a career intelligence officer who'd transitioned from military service to civilian contracting after the Iraq War. His manner was professional but guarded, and Wren got the impression that the Major was more comfortable dealing with foreign adversaries than domestic anomalies. Accuracy, Granger said simply. Every other subject we've studied shows sporadic hits mixed with obvious misses. Ellison is batting nearly perfect. Perfect at what? Predicting future events, technical developments, political changes, environmental disasters. He's been right about things that hadn't even been planned yet when he made his predictions. Wren studied the file. Graham's visions had indeed been remarkably prescient. In the months following his river encounter, he'd predicted a major oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, described advances in military drone technology that wouldn't be publicly revealed for years, and accurately forecast the outcome of several congressional elections. How is he getting this information? That's what we want you to determine, Granger said. Is it psychic ability, foreign intelligence, or something else entirely? And if it's something else, Granger's expression grew serious, then we need to understand it before someone else does. Wren spent weeks analysing the data, looking for patterns that might explain Graham's abilities. The man's brain scans showed unusual activity in the temporal lobe, but nothing that would typically be associated with psychic phenomena. His background check revealed no connections to foreign intelligence services or access to classified information. The breakthrough came when Wren examined the electromagnetic readings from the sensor devices that had been placed around Graham's property. The data showed periodic bursts of extremely low frequency waves that seemed to correlate with the timing of Graham's most accurate predictions. It's like he's receiving radio transmissions, Wren told Granger during their weekly meeting. But the frequency is so low that it would require a massive antenna to generate naturally. Could it be artificial? The power requirements would be enormous. You'd need something the size of a small city to generate this kind of signal, or something not bound by our understanding of physics. The possibility that Graham was in contact with non-human intelligence was the elephant in the room that no one wanted to discuss directly. But as Wren dug deeper into the data, it became increasingly difficult to ignore. The decision to make direct contact with Graham came from above Granger's pay grade. Wren was authorised to travel to North Carolina and conduct an interview, but with strict parameters. He was to present himself as a university researcher studying electromagnetic anomalies, not a government contractor investigating alien contact. Graham agreed to meet at a diner in Fayetteville, a public place where he'd feel comfortable. Wren arrived early and studied the man who walked through the door. Graham Ellison looked exactly like his photographs. A working-class veteran with calloused hands and cautious eyes. But there was something else there too, a quality that Wren couldn't quite define. "Mr. Ellison," Wren said, extending his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Dr. Wren," Graham replied, his handshake firm but brief. "I have to say, I'm getting tired of talking to researchers." "I understand you've had several visitors recently. EPA, Air Force, even someone claiming to be from the Smithsonian. They all want to know about the lights I saw, but none of them seem interested in helping me understand what happened." Wren ordered coffee and studied Graham's face. The man was tired, stressed, and clearly suspicious of yet another government researcher. But there was something else there too, a sense of purpose, as if Graham was carrying knowledge that he couldn't quite articulate. "What do you think happened to you?" Wren asked. Graham was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, I think I made contact with something that's been trying to communicate with humanity for a long time, and I think your government is more interested in controlling that communication than understanding it." "What makes you say that?" "Because every time I have a vision or a dream about the future, you people show up to ask questions. It's like you're monitoring me somehow." Wren felt a chill. Graham wasn't supposed to be aware of the surveillance. What kind of visions? Things that are going to happen, problems that need to be solved. Sometimes I wake up with technical specifications for devices I've never seen before. Graham pulled a notebook from his jacket and showed Wren a page filled with detailed diagrams. "Tell me, Doctor. Wren, what do you think this is?" Wren studied the drawings. They appeared to be schematics for some kind of energy generation system, but the physics involved were beyond current human understanding. The designs incorporated principles that wouldn't be discovered for decades, if ever. "Where did these come from?" "She shows them to me," Graham said. "The lady made of light. She tells me that humanity is approaching a critical point and that we need to make certain choices if we want to survive." "What kind of choices?" "How we relate to each other, how we treat the environment, how we handle the knowledge that we're not alone in the universe." Graham's voice grew quiet. "She says that disclosure is coming, but not in the way people expect. It's going to happen through trauma, through crisis, because that's the only way humanity learns to change." Wren felt his worldview shifting. Everything in his scientific training told him that Graham was delusional, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The man was receiving information that he couldn't possibly have access to through normal means. "Dr. Wren," Graham said, "I need you to understand something. I'm not the only one. There are others like me, people who've been contacted and are receiving information. Your government knows about us, and they're studying us like lab animals. What do you want me to do about it?" "Stop treating us like subjects and start treating us like partners, because what's coming is going to affect everyone, and we're going to need all the help we can get." After the interview, Wren returned to Langley with more questions than answers. His report to Major Granger was carefully worded, but his conclusion was clear. Graham Ellison was in contact with an intelligence that possessed knowledge beyond current human understanding. "What's your recommendation?" Granger asked. "We need to start taking this seriously," Wren said. "If there are others like him, we need to find them and try to understand what they're being told. And if what they're being told is accurate, then we're dealing with something that could change everything we know about human civilization." Granger was quiet for a long moment. "Dr. Wren, I'm going to upgrade your clearance to Umbra level. There are some things you need to know about what we're really dealing with." The briefing that followed changed everything Wren thought he knew about the government's interest in Graham Ellison. Project Threshold wasn't just monitoring psychic phenomena. It was part of a larger program designed to establish contact with non-human intelligences that had been observing humanity for decades. The entities were real, they were here, and they were trying to communicate. Graham Ellison wasn't just a subject of study. He was humanity's first ambassador to a civilization that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space and time. The question was, what did they want, and was humanity ready to hear the answer? 2008 se 2012. Graham Ellison had learned to live with the impossible. The woman made of starlight visited him with increasing frequency, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in waking visions that left him disoriented and filled with knowledge he couldn't possibly possess. She never gave him her name, and he'd begun thinking of her simply as the lady. Their conversations took place in a space that wasn't quite physical, but felt more real than ordinary reality. The lady appeared as a figure of pure light, her features shifting and flowing like water, but her presence was unmistakably feminine and deeply compassionate. "You're afraid," she said during one of their early encounters. They were standing by the Cape Fear River, but it was the river as it had been centuries ago, clear and pristine, surrounded by ancient forest. "Of course I'm afraid," Graham replied. "I don't understand what's happening to me." "You're becoming a conduit," the lady explained. "A bridge between your species and ours. It's a natural process, but one that few of your kind are capable of sustaining." "What do you want from me?" "To prepare your people for what's coming. Change is inevitable, but the form it takes depends on choices that haven't been made yet." Over the following months, the lady showed Graham visions of possible futures. Some were hopeful: humanity working together to solve environmental problems, developing new technologies that respected the natural world, reaching out to the stars with wisdom and humility. Others were terrifying: ecological collapse, war, the breakdown of civilization itself. "Which future will come to pass?" Graham asked. "That depends on you," the lady replied. "All of you. The choices you make in the next few years will determine whether your species survives its adolescence." The visions began to manifest in Graham's daily life as specific, detailed prophecies. In March 2008, he woke from a dream about a massive oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, complete with images of burning platforms and dead wildlife. He wrote down everything he could remember, including the location and approximate timing: late spring 2010. 2 years later, the Deepwater Horizon exploded on April 20th, 2010, in almost exactly the location Graham had seen in his vision. The prophecy that truly terrified him came in September 2009. The lady showed him images of military vehicles moving through American cities, people in face masks, and what appeared to be some kind of global crisis that would begin in late 2019 or early 2020. "What is this?" Graham asked. "A test," the lady replied. "Your species will face a challenge that requires cooperation and wisdom. How you respond will determine whether you're ready for contact." "Contact with who?" "With us. With the civilizations that have been watching you develop. You're not alone, Graham, but you're not ready to join the larger community. Not yet." Graham tried to document these visions, but he found that the government's surveillance of his life had intensified. His phone was obviously tapped, his mail was being intercepted, and there were always vehicles parked near his property. When he tried to share his experiences online, his posts were quickly deleted or buried by algorithm changes. The isolation was taking its toll. His wife had left him in 2009, unable to cope with the constant stress of government surveillance and her husband's increasingly erratic behaviour. His children visited less frequently, and his business was suffering as potential clients were scared away by the mysterious men in suits who seemed to follow him everywhere. In 2011, the lady's messages became more urgent. She showed him visions of advanced military technology that wouldn't be publicly revealed for years. Triangular aircraft that moved without visible propulsion, weapons that could disable electronics from a distance, and surveillance systems that tracked individual humans through their unique electromagnetic signatures. "They're trying to reverse engineer our technology," the lady explained. "Your government has recovered some of our vehicles and is attempting to understand how they work." "Is that bad?" "It's dangerous. They're approaching the technology from a place of fear and aggression, not wisdom and cooperation. That path leads to destruction." Graham began to realise that his role wasn't just to receive information, but to serve as a conduit for a larger communication. The lady wasn't just showing him the future. She was trying to influence it by working through him and others like him. "How many others are there?" he asked. "Not many. Your species isn't naturally telepathic, but some individuals have the neurological flexibility to establish contact. You're one of the strongest we've encountered." The burden of this knowledge was overwhelming. Graham felt like he was carrying the weight of humanity's future on his shoulders, and the government's response suggested that they saw him as either a valuable asset or a dangerous threat. In 2012, the lady's final major prophecy came to pass with devastating accuracy. She'd shown him images of what appeared to be a school shooting, complete with specific details about the location and timing. Graham had tried to warn authorities, but his calls were dismissed as the ramblings of a known conspiracy theorist. When the Sandy Hook shooting occurred almost exactly as the lady had predicted, Graham realised that his warnings weren't being ignored. They were being suppressed. The government knew about his abilities, but they were more interested in studying him than in preventing the tragedies he foresaw. "Why won't you stop these things from happening?" Graham asked the lady during one of their conversations. "Because they're necessary," she replied sadly. "Your species learns through trauma and crisis. These events are terrible, but they're also catalysts for change. Without them, humanity would remain stagnant." "So you're just going to let people die?" "We don't control your world, Graham. We can only observe and try to guide. The choices are yours to make." The lady's messages became less frequent after 2012, but more philosophical. She spoke about the nature of consciousness, the connection between all living things, and humanity's potential role in a galactic community that existed beyond the physical universe. "You think of us as aliens," she said during one of their last conversations, "but we're not separate from you. We're what you might become if you choose the path of wisdom over the path of fear." "What happens if we choose fear?" "Then you'll destroy yourselves, and we'll wait for the next species to evolve to the point where contact becomes possible." Graham realised that the lady's visits were both a gift and a test. Humanity was being evaluated, and the results would determine whether the species was ready to join a larger community of consciousness that spanned the galaxy. The question was, would they pass the test, or would they fail like so many others before them? 2013. The anonymous meeting took place in a parking garage in Arlington, Virginia, at midnight on a Tuesday in February. Rowan Knox had been investigating the Ellison case for 6 years, but her source had never agreed to meet in person until now. The man who approached her car was older than she had expected, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested military service. He wore a dark overcoat and carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive but well worn. "Ms. Knox," he said, sliding into the passenger seat. "Thank you for coming." "I still don't know who you are," Rowan said. "Let's just say I'm someone who's spent most of his career in rooms that don't officially exist, dealing with problems that can't be publicly acknowledged." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder marked with classifications that Rowan had never seen before. "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I assure you that every word is documented and verified." "I'm listening." The United States government has been in contact with non-human intelligences for over 70 years, not through crashed spacecraft or abducted civilians, but through individuals like Graham Ellison who serve as communication conduits. Rowan felt her worldview tilting. "You're talking about telepathic contact. We prefer the term consciousness interface," the man said. "These beings exist primarily as pure consciousness, though they can manifest physical forms when necessary. They've been observing human civilization and occasionally making contact with individuals who have the neurological capacity to receive their communications." "How many people know about this?" "Very few. There's a doctrine called compartmented non-disclosure that keeps this information restricted to a small circle of officials across multiple agencies. Most people in government don't even know it exists." He pulled out a photograph showing what appeared to be a meeting room with several military officers seated around a table. At the head of the table was a figure that seemed to be composed of shifting light. "This was taken in 1987, he said. Direct contact with an entity the committee designated as Mentor 7. The meeting lasted 4 hours and covered topics ranging from nuclear weapons to environmental policy. What did they want? To prevent humanity from destroying itself. These beings have watched numerous civilizations reach our level of technological development, and most don't survive the transition. They're trying to help us avoid that fate. Rowan studied the photograph. The figure at the head of the table was clearly not human, but there was something oddly familiar about it. This looks like the entity that Ellison describes. Graham isn't the first contact, but he's one of the most receptive. Most people who experience direct contact suffer psychological breakdown within months. Graham has maintained stable communication for over 6 years. What makes him different? Genetic factors, probably. His neurological structure seems naturally adapted for this kind of communication. We've identified maybe 24 individuals worldwide with similar capabilities. The man pulled out another document. This one marked Observer Project Classification Umbra/White. The pages were heavily redacted, but Rowan could make out references to beacon subjects, consciousness mapping, and strategic communication protocols. The Observer Project is the current iteration of our contact program, he explained. We monitor individuals who show signs of contact and try to understand how the communication works. The ultimate goal is to establish direct controlled contact without needing human intermediaries. And Graham doesn't know about this. He suspects, but he doesn't know the full scope. We've been careful to maintain the illusion that he's being studied for conventional reasons. Rowan felt sick. You're using him. We're protecting him, the man corrected. Do you have any idea what would happen if this information became public? Religious fundamentalists would declare him either a prophet or a demon. Governments around the world would try to kidnap or kill him. His only protection is our secrecy. What about the information he's receiving? The prophecies? All accurate, as far as we can verify. The entities seem to have access to information about future probabilities that our best intelligence analysts can't match. They've warned us about terrorist attacks, natural disasters, even market crashes. Then why don't you act on those warnings? The man's expression grew grim. Because acting on them would reveal that we have access to prophetic information. That would expose the entire program. So we document the predictions, verify their accuracy, and try to learn how the system works. While people die, while we try to understand something that could determine the survival of our species, these beings aren't omnipotent, Ms. Knox. They can show us possible futures, but they can't force us to make better choices. Rowan realised that she was looking at a shadow government that operated beyond the normal structure of democratic oversight. A group of officials who believed they were protecting humanity by managing contact with non-human intelligence, even if it meant sacrificing individual lives for the greater good. Why are you telling me this? Because the situation is changing. The entities are becoming more active, making contact with more individuals. The old model of compartmented secrecy isn't going to work much longer. What's coming? Disclosure. Not the kind that UFO researchers imagine, but something much more significant. The entities are preparing to make themselves known to humanity as a whole, and they're using people like Graham to prepare the way. The man closed his briefcase and prepared to leave. Miss Knox, I want you to understand something. What you've learned tonight makes you a person of interest to very powerful people. Your investigation into Graham Ellison has brought you to the attention of agencies that don't officially exist. Is that a threat? It's a reality. From now on, you'll be watched, monitored, and evaluated. How you handle this information will determine whether you're seen as an asset or a liability. After he left, Rowan sat in her car for a long time, trying to process what she had learned. The government wasn't covering up evidence of non-human intelligence. They were managing humanity's introduction to a galactic community that existed beyond physical space. Graham Ellison wasn't just a contact subject. He was humanity's first ambassador to a civilization that had been watching and guiding human development for centuries. And Rowan Knox, investigative journalist, had just become part of the most significant story in human history. The question was, what was she going to do about it? 2013 se 2018. The Halford Dynamics trailer arrived on a Thursday morning in October 2013, delivered by a team of technicians who spoke in clipped professional tones and avoided eye contact with Graham Ellison. They positioned the unmarked white trailer at the edge of his property, explaining that it was part of a long-term atmospheric monitoring study being conducted in partnership with several government agencies. Graham watched them work from his kitchen window, noting the sophisticated equipment they installed around the trailer: satellite dishes, atmospheric sensors, and what appeared to be some kind of electromagnetic detection array. The setup looked more like a military surveillance post than a weather station. "Mr. Ellison," the lead technician said when they finished, "this equipment will be completely automated. You won't hear any noise and it won't interfere with your daily activities. We'll check on it monthly, but otherwise you can ignore it." "What exactly are you monitoring?" "Atmospheric conditions, electromagnetic fluctuations, that sort of thing. Standard environmental data collection." After they left, Graham walked around the trailer studying its construction. The windows were tinted black, making it impossible to see inside, and the door was secured with electronic locks that required keycard access. Whatever was inside, it wasn't standard weather monitoring equipment. That night, the lady appeared to him for the first time in months. "They're listening more carefully now," she said. They were standing in the ethereal version of his backyard, but the landscape was different. The trees were taller, older, and the sky had a quality that reminded Graham of deep space. What are they listening for? "Our conversations. They've learned that consciousness creates electromagnetic patterns, and they're trying to record and decode our communications." "Can they do that?" "Not yet, but they're developing the technology. Dr. Wren believes that consciousness operates on quantum frequencies that can be detected and possibly replicated." Graham felt a chill. "They want to talk to you directly." "Yes, but they approach from a place of fear and desire for control. Direct contact with us requires openness, trust, and the willingness to accept that your species is not the dominant intelligence in this region of space." "What happens if they succeed?" "Depending on their intentions, either a great leap forward for humanity, or the beginning of a conflict that your species cannot win." Over the following months, Graham noticed changes in his ability to communicate with the lady. Their conversations became shorter and less frequent, often interrupted by what felt like electronic interference. Sometimes he would wake from a dream knowing that she had tried to contact him, but unable to remember what she had said. The surveillance around his property intensified. The monthly equipment checks became weekly, then daily. Graham began to recognize the faces of the technicians, noting that they were too fit and too alert to be simple contractors. These were intelligence operatives, probably military. In 2014, Graham made the decision to stop speaking publicly about his experiences. He deleted his online accounts, stopped responding to researchers, and told his remaining friends and family that he wanted to put the whole experience behind him. To outside observers, it appeared that he had lost interest in his UFO experiences and returned to a normal life. The truth was more complex. The lady had asked him to maintain silence while she and her kind evaluated humanity's readiness for broader contact. His public statements had been monitored and analysed by governments around the world, and the response had been troubling. "Your leaders see us as either a threat to be neutralised or a resource to be exploited," the lady explained during one of their few uninterrupted conversations. "They cannot conceive of a relationship based on mutual respect and cooperation." "What about ordinary people?" "Many are ready, but they're not the ones making decisions about how your species responds to contact." During the years of public silence, Graham's private experiences with the lady intensified. She showed him visions of advanced civilizations throughout the galaxy, some that had successfully made the transition to what she called galactic citizenship, and others that had destroyed themselves through fear and aggression. "What determines which path a species takes?" Graham asked. "Their relationship with consciousness itself. Species that understand that consciousness is the fundamental force in the universe learn to cooperate and evolve. Those that remain trapped in material thinking inevitably destroy themselves. Which category do humans fall into?" "That's still being determined. You're at a critical juncture. The next decade will reveal whether your species has the wisdom to survive its own technological power." The visions Graham received during this period were more abstract than his earlier prophecies. dealing with fundamental questions about the nature of reality rather than specific future events. The lady showed him that consciousness was not produced by the brain, but was rather a universal field that brains could access under the right conditions. Your scientists are beginning to understand this, she said. Quantum mechanics is revealing that consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining physical reality. When they fully grasp this principle, they'll be ready for contact. How long will that take? For the scientists, perhaps a generation. For your governments, much longer. They're too invested in maintaining control through secrecy and force. In 2016, Graham began to experience what he could only describe as interference in his communications with the lady. Their conversations were increasingly interrupted by bursts of static, electromagnetic noise, and sometimes what sounded like human voices speaking in technical jargon. They're getting closer, the lady warned him. Dr. Wren has developed equipment that can detect our communications, even if he can't decode them yet. What should I do? Prepare for a period of silence. We may need to suspend contact until the situation stabilises. The last clear communication Graham received from the lady came in late 2017. She appeared to him one final time, but her image was flickering and unstable, like a television signal breaking up. The disclosure is beginning, she said, not through government announcements, but through the gradual revelation of our presence to your military and intelligence agencies. They will resist this knowledge, but eventually they will have no choice but to acknowledge it. What about people like me? You've served your purpose as a bridge, but the next phase requires direct contact between our civilizations. Your role may be ending, but your contribution will not be forgotten. Will I see you again? When your species is ready, we will return. But for now, we must step back and allow humanity to make its own choices about its future. After that, silence. Graham continued to have dreams that felt significant, but the clear, detailed communications from the lady stopped entirely. The ethereal woman who had guided him for over a decade had withdrawn, leaving him feeling isolated and purposeless. The surveillance continued, but it had a different quality now. The observers seemed less interested in what Graham was experiencing and more focused on monitoring his environment for signs of ongoing contact. They knew the communications had stopped, and they were trying to understand why. Graham realised that he had become a relic of an earlier phase of contact, a bridge that was no longer needed. The lady and her kind had moved on to the next stage of their plan, whatever that might be. All he could do was wait and watch as the world began to change in ways that most people didn't yet understand. 2022. The world began to unravel in March 2020, exactly as the lady had shown Graham in her visions 12 years earlier. The pandemic swept across the globe with devastating efficiency, bringing human civilization to a standstill and forcing governments to confront the fragility of their carefully constructed systems. Graham watched the unfolding crisis from his isolated property in North Carolina, recognizing each development as something the lady had prepared him for. The lockdowns, the economic disruption, the social unrest that followed, all of it had been foreseen and explained as a necessary catalyst for humanity's next evolutionary step. Dr. Elias Wren arrived unannounced on a cold February morning in 2021. Graham hadn't seen the physicist in over 3 years, but the man who stood at his door looked like he'd aged a decade. His hair was completely grey now, his face deeply lined, and his eyes had the haunted quality of someone who'd seen too much. "Mr. Ellison," Wren said, "we need to talk." They sat in Graham's kitchen, drinking coffee while snow fell outside the window. Wren seemed nervous, constantly checking his phone and glancing toward the windows as if expecting surveillance. "The project has changed," Wren said without preamble. "What started as scientific research has become something else entirely." "What do you mean?" "There are factions within the intelligence community that want to weaponize contact with the entities. They believe that if they can establish direct communication, they can gain access to advanced technology and use it for military purposes." Graham felt a familiar chill. "That's exactly what the lady warned me about." "The lady?" Wren leaned forward. You've had recent contact. Not for years, but she told me this would happen. She said that humans would approach their technology from a place of fear and aggression, and that it would lead to disaster. Wren was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Ellison, I need you to know that there are people in very high places who see you as either an asset to be exploited or a threat to be eliminated. The fact that your contact has ceased makes some of them nervous. Why? Because they think it means the entities have given up on humanity. And if that's true, then all the resources we've invested in understanding this phenomenon have been wasted. Or, Graham said slowly, it means that the entities are preparing for the next phase. What next phase? Direct contact. Not through intermediaries like me, but with humanity as a whole. The lady told me that disclosure would come through trauma and crisis, because that's the only way our species learns to change. Wren's expression grew grim. If that's true, then we're about to enter a very dangerous period, because there are people who will do anything to prevent that kind of disclosure from happening. Over the following months, Graham noticed increased activity around his property. The Halford Dynamics trailer was upgraded with new equipment, and the number of surveillance vehicles in the area doubled. It felt like the calm before a storm. The breakthrough came in the form of a dream unlike any Graham had experienced since the lady's departure. He found himself standing in what appeared to be a vast amphitheatre, filled with beings of light, all of them focused on a central figure who radiated authority and compassion. Graham Ellison, the figure said, its voice resonating through his consciousness like a bell. You have served as a faithful bridge between our civilizations. Now the time has come for the next phase of contact. What do you want me to do? Tell your species that we are here, that we have always been here, and that we come in peace. But also tell them that their leaders' attempts to weaponize our technology will not be permitted. They won't listen to me. I'm just one person. You won't be alone. Others are receiving this same message. The disclosure is beginning and it cannot be stopped. Graham woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The lady and her kind hadn't abandoned humanity. They had been preparing for this moment. The pandemic, the social unrest, the breakdown of old systems, all of it had been necessary to create the conditions for a new kind of contact. He spent the following weeks documenting his final vision, writing down every detail he could remember. When he finished, he had a document that read like a manifesto, a declaration that humanity was not alone and that the time for secrecy was ending. On March 15th, 2022, Graham posted his final message to a dozen online forums and social media platforms. To anyone who reads this, I want you to know that we are not alone in the universe. For the past 15 years, I have been in contact with intelligences that exist beyond our normal understanding of reality. They have been watching humanity develop, and they have been trying to guide us toward a future where we can join a larger community of conscious beings. Our governments know about this contact. They have been studying people like me for decades, trying to understand how to communicate with these entities directly. But they approach from a place of fear and desire for control, and that approach will only lead to conflict. The entities I've communicated with are not our enemies. They are our potential mentors, teachers who want to help us avoid the mistakes that have destroyed other civilizations. But they will not force their help on us. The choice is ours to make. I'm sharing this information because I believe that the time for secrecy is ending. What's coming will affect all of us, and we deserve to know the truth. They've always been here. What we thought was divine was never separate from the stars. Watch the skies, watch for signs, and remember that consciousness is the fundamental force in the universe. Everything else is just details. Within hours, the post had been viewed thousands of times and shared across multiple platforms. But by the next morning, it had vanished from the internet entirely, removed by automated systems that flagged it as potentially harmful misinformation. Graham wasn't surprised. He had expected the suppression, even prepared for it. The message wasn't really intended for the general public anyway. It was a signal, a beacon lit for others like him who had been waiting for permission to speak. 2 weeks later, Graham Ellison disappeared. His truck was found parked at the Cape Fear River, in the exact spot where he'd first encountered the lights 15 years earlier. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play. His wallet, keys and cell phone were still in the vehicle, but Graham himself was gone. The official investigation concluded that he had probably drowned, though his body was never found. Local authorities noted that the river had been running high due to recent rains, and suggested that he might have fallen in while fishing. But those who knew the real story suspected something different. Graham Ellison hadn't drowned. He had been taken, either by the entities he'd spent years communicating with, or by the government agencies that had been monitoring him. The truth, as always, remained classified. 3 months after Graham Ellison's disappearance, a package arrived at Rowan Knox's apartment in Arlington, Virginia. There was no return address, no postmark, and no indication of how it had been delivered. It simply appeared on her doorstep one morning, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was a hard drive and a note written in Graham's unmistakable handwriting. "For when the time is right, they're coming home." GE double quote. Rowan had been expecting something like this. Her investigation into the Ellison case had taught her that nothing in this story ended cleanly. There were always loose threads, hidden documents, and final revelations that arrived when you least expected them. She connected the hard drive to an isolated computer, one that wasn't connected to the internet or any network. The files it contained made her question everything she thought she knew about the nature of reality. The first folder contained medical scans of Graham's brain and nervous system, taken over a period of 15 years. The images showed progressive changes in his neural structure, with new pathways forming in regions associated with telepathic and psychic phenomena. It was as if his contact with the entities had physically rewired his consciousness. The second folder contained surveillance footage from cameras around Graham's property. The videos showed the lights he'd described, but they also revealed something else. The lights were responding to Graham's presence, forming patterns and configurations that suggested deliberate communication. In one particularly striking sequence, the lights arranged themselves into geometric shapes that matched the symbols Graham had been drawing in his notebooks. The entities weren't just communicating through visions and dreams. They were creating physical manifestations that could be recorded and studied. The third folder contained classified documents marked Observer Project Clearance Umbra/White. These files detailed a government program that had been monitoring individuals with psychic abilities for over 40 years, building a database of people who could potentially serve as communication conduits with non-human intelligence. But the most shocking revelation came in the final folder: transcripts of communications between government officials and the entities themselves. The documents revealed that direct contact had been established as early as 1987, and that ongoing negotiations had been taking place about the terms of disclosure. The entities had been patient, working through intermediaries like Graham, while government officials debated how to manage the revelation of their presence. But that patience was running out. The final document was dated just 1 week before Graham's disappearance. It was a communication from the entities to a classified government committee, and its message was unambiguous. The period of gradual introduction is ending. We have attempted to work within your governmental structures to prepare humanity for disclosure, but your continued focus on control and weaponization makes cooperation impossible. We are therefore initiating direct contact protocols. This will not be a hostile action, but it will not require your permission or cooperation. Humanity will learn of our presence through direct experience, not through managed government disclosure. The time for secrecy is over. Rowan realised that Graham's disappearance hadn't been the end of the story. It had been the beginning of something much larger. The entities were moving to the next phase of their plan, and the governments that had spent decades trying to control the contact were about to lose all influence over the process. She spent weeks analysing the files, cross-referencing them with her own research and looking for patterns that might predict what would happen next. The picture that emerged was both thrilling and terrifying. The entities were planning a series of public manifestations that would make their presence undeniable. Not aggressive demonstrations, but unmistakable proof that humanity was not alone in the universe. They would appear over major cities, communicate directly with world leaders, and make it clear that the age of human isolation was ending. But they were also prepared for resistance. The files suggested that they had contingency plans for dealing with military responses, and that they possessed technology that could neutralize human weapons without causing casualties. It would be disclosure on their terms, not humanity's. Rowan was still analysing the files when she had her first direct experience with the entities. It happened on a Tuesday night in October, as she was working late in her apartment. She noticed a soft glow outside her window and looked up to see 3 orbs of light hovering motionless above the parking lot. The orbs pulsed in unison, and suddenly Rowan found herself standing in the ethereal space that Graham had described in his writings. She was by the Cape Fear River, but it was the river as it existed in some other dimension, surrounded by ancient trees under a sky filled with stars. A figure approached her from the tree line. It was the lady, the same entity that had communicated with Graham for over a decade. She appeared as a woman made of starlight, beautiful and serene, with eyes that held the wisdom of ages. "Rowan Knox," the lady said, her voice like music. "You have served as a chronicler of the bridge between our worlds. Now you will serve as a witness to the next phase. What's going to happen? What should have happened long ago? Direct contact between our civilizations. Your governments have had their chance to manage this process responsibly, but they have chosen the path of fear and control. Will there be conflict? Only if your leaders choose it. We come in peace, but we will not be denied or dismissed. Humanity is ready for contact, even if its governments are not." The lady gestured toward the sky, and Rowan saw what appeared to be a vast network of light-connecting stars across the galaxy. "This is the community you will join if you choose wisdom over fear, consciousness connected across space and time, working together to nurture life and understanding throughout the universe. What's my role in this? To tell the story, to help your species understand that what's coming is not an invasion, but an invitation. We are offering humanity a choice. Remain isolated and eventually destroy yourselves, or join the larger community and help us nurture consciousness throughout the galaxy." When the vision ended, Rowan found herself back in her apartment, staring out at an empty parking lot. But she knew that everything had changed. The story she'd been investigating for over 15 years was entering its final chapter, and she was going to have a front row seat. Over the following weeks, reports began to appear of similar encounters around the world. People in major cities reported seeing lights in the sky that responded to their thoughts and emotions. Scientists at research facilities found their equipment detecting signals that couldn't be explained by conventional physics. Religious leaders reported visions and prophetic dreams that all carried the same message. Something momentous was approaching. The governments of the world tried to suppress these reports, but the sheer volume of encounters made concealment impossible. Social media platforms were flooded with videos of unexplained lights, and conspiracy forums buzzed with theories about impending disclosure. But Rowan knew it wasn't a conspiracy. It was an inevitability. The entities that had been watching humanity develop for centuries were finally ready to make themselves known, and no amount of government secrecy could stop what was coming. The beacon that Graham Ellison had lit 15 years earlier by the Cape Fear River had done its job. It had served as a bridge between 2 civilizations, preparing the way for a contact that would change everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe. Now all that remained was to see whether humanity would choose wisdom or fear when faced with the greatest revelation in its history. The lights were coming home, and the age of human isolation was about to end. As Rowan finished documenting the files from Graham's hard drive, she felt a familiar presence in her room. She looked up to see a soft glow emanating from her window, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. The lady had kept her promise to return. The cycle was beginning again, but this time it wouldn't end with a single beacon. This time the entire world would witness the light. The beacon at Cape Fear had served its purpose. Now it was time for humanity to decide what kind of future it wanted to create. And somewhere, in a place beyond normal space and time, Graham Ellison watched and waited to see what choice his species would make. The end was only the beginning. Speaking of mysteries, I'm curious, what do you think really happened with Cicada 3301? Were they genuine recruitment puzzles, an elaborate art project, or something far more sinister? And while we're on the topic of rabbit holes, what conspiracies would you like me to explore next? Government time travel experiments, the true purpose behind social media algorithms, or perhaps something even stranger lurking in the depths of the internet? If you're new here, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories for more mind-bending stories that blur the line between fiction and reality. Your support helps me dive deeper into these mysteries that keep us all awake at night. Now, settle in as we explore a digital mystery that may change how you view the very nature of human consciousness itself. The cursor blinked against the black terminal screen like a digital heartbeat, steady and hypnotic in the darkness of Kellen Virek's cluttered apartment. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic skyline around his triple monitor setup, testament to another sleepless night spent diving into the digital abyss. The year was 2022, and what had started as research for a nostalgic blog series about the legendary Cicada 3301 puzzles had morphed into something far more consuming. Kellen had been 15 when the first Cicada puzzle appeared in 2012, too young and untrained to participate in the global treasure hunt that had captivated the darkest corners of the internet. But now, at 25, with a master's degree in cybersecurity and a growing reputation as a digital archaeologist, he possessed the tools to excavate the digital bones of that mysterious organisation. The original Cicada 3301 had been legendary among cryptography enthusiasts. Starting with a simple image posted to 4chan, the puzzles had evolved into a complex web of steganography, classical ciphers, and real-world clues that led participants across continents. The organisation claimed to be recruiting highly intelligent individuals for purposes unknown, and after releasing puzzles in 2012, 2013, and 2014, they had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. Or so the world believed. Kellen's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, navigating through archived Tor nodes and forgotten data caches. He had spent weeks reconstructing the original puzzle trail, verifying each step against community documentation, when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There was an extra file, hidden in the metadata of a long-dead Tor node, archived in a mirror that shouldn't have existed. Was a cryptographic hash that appeared nowhere in the public record. The file was tiny, barely 2 kilobytes, but it carried a digital signature that matched the known Cicada encryption patterns. The timestamp read November 11th, 2014 at 11:11:11 UTC. 11:11:11:11:11. The file was titled Cycle Unbroken and contained a single image, a black square with what appeared to be random white pixels scattered across its surface. To an untrained eye, it looked like digital noise, but Kellen had studied enough steganography to recognise the subtle patterns hidden within apparent chaos. He ran the image through every tool in his arsenal. Standard LSB steganography revealed nothing. Frequency analysis showed random distribution. Even quantum-safe cryptographic methods yielded no results. Whatever cipher had been used, it was unlike anything in the public domain. As the hours ticked by, Kellen found himself drawn deeper into the puzzle's gravitational pull. There was something about the pattern of pixels that seemed familiar, as if his mind was trying to recognise a language it had never learned. He printed the image and pinned it to his wall, stepping back to examine it from different angles. That's when he saw it. The pixels weren't random. They formed a pattern that repeated every 17 positions, creating a subtle grid that became visible only when viewed from a specific distance. The number 17 was significant in cryptography, a prime number often used in advanced encryption schemes. Working with renewed energy, Kellen began treating the image as a musical score, with each pixel representing a note in a complex composition. He assigned values to the positions, created mathematical relationships between the patterns, and slowly began to decode what would later prove to be the most dangerous message he had ever encountered. The decryption process took 3 days of continuous work. When the plain text finally emerged from the digital noise, Kellen stared at the screen with a mixture of triumph and growing unease. The harvest exceeded expectations. Neural pattern recognition in Phase 3 candidates shows unprecedented synchronization. The 11 protocol is ready for field testing. Signal isolation trials in Prague have confirmed our hypothesis. The candidates aren't supposed to survive. They're supposed to evolve. First contact procedures are now in effect. The frequency is opening. Below the message was a series of coordinates, an encrypted chat log timestamp, and a single line that would haunt Kellen's dreams for weeks to come. You have found what was meant to be found. The archive remembers. 3302 is calling. The message had been decoded, but its implications were only beginning to unfold. Kellen saved the decrypted text to an encrypted partition and immediately began experiencing what he initially dismissed as coincidence. His normally stable Linux system started displaying strange glitches, brief flashes of text in languages he didn't recognize, audio files that played backwards without command, and error messages that appeared in perfect English but described system states that shouldn't exist. Paranoia, he told himself. The mind's tendency to find patterns where none existed. But when his supposedly secure network began connecting to IP addresses he had never authorized, Kellen made a decision that would save his life. He disconnected from the internet entirely and began rebuilding his analysis environment on completely isolated hardware. The air-gapped machine was a beast of custom silicon and hardened storage, designed for exactly this kind of sensitive work. As Kellen transferred the Cicada files to the secure system, he noticed something that made his hands shake. The file size of the original image had changed. Not corrupted, not damaged, but genuinely altered, as if the data itself was alive and growing. Working in complete isolation, free from the strange digital interference that had plagued his networked systems, Kellen began a deeper analysis of the encrypted chat log referenced in the decoded message. The encryption was military grade, but the mathematical keys followed patterns similar to those used in the original Cicada puzzles. After 18 hours of continuous cryptanalysis, the conversation began to emerge. The chat log was dated September 15, 2014, nearly 2 years after the last public Cicada puzzle. The participants were identified only by cryptographic signatures, but their conversation revealed the true scope of what Cicada 3301 had actually been. Participant A. The Prague trials exceeded all projections. Subject 7 achieved full signal synchronization within 48 hours of exposure. Participant B, biological response. Participant A, cellular restructuring began immediately. Neural pathways showed complete reorganization. The subject reported experiencing expanded temporal perception and demonstrated the ability to process information at speeds that should be physiologically impossible. Participant B, and the psychological evaluation. Participant A. This is where it gets interesting. Standard personality assessments became impossible to administer. The subject claimed that questions about human emotional responses were contextually irrelevant and began demonstrating knowledge of information that hadn't been provided during the trial. Participant B. You're talking about telepathy. Participant A. I'm talking about something far more significant. The subject wasn't reading minds. They were accessing information directly from digital systems, without any technological interface. They described our computer networks as visible conversations, and began predicting system failures hours before they occurred. Participant B, the 11 protocol worked. Participant A, the 11 protocol worked too well. We lost subject 7 during the third phase of testing. Not killed, not injured. Lost. They described feeling pulled toward a larger conversation and disappeared from the facility without triggering any security systems. The cameras show them walking toward the exit, but they never appear on any exterior surveillance. Participant B, where did they go? Participant A, we think they went somewhere else, not geographically, dimensionally. The signal they were synchronized to appears to operate on frequencies that exist parallel to our normal reality. They're still here, but they're not here. The conversation continued for several more exchanges, each more disturbing than the last. References to cognitive evolution, post-human consciousness, and preparation for integration painted a picture of an organisation that had discovered something extraordinary hidden within the framework of human cognition. But the most chilling part of the log came at the end. Participant A. The original puzzle solvers are showing signs of spontaneous evolution. Even without direct protocol exposure, their brains are beginning to resonate with the frequency. The selection process was more effective than we anticipated. Participant B, how many? Participant A, 17 individuals worldwide. They're becoming aware of the signal naturally. Some are seeking us out. Others are simply disappearing. Participant B, and the others? The ones who participated but didn't reach the final stages? Participant A, they're starting to notice things, patterns in digital systems that shouldn't be there, messages in network traffic that appear to be communications from the evolved subjects. The boundary between states is becoming more porous. Participant B, are we losing control of the experiment? Participant A, I don't think it was ever an experiment. I think it was an invitation, and I think something has been waiting for us to become sophisticated enough to accept it. The log ended abruptly, but attached to the file was a list of names and locations. 17 individuals from around the world who had participated in the original cicada puzzles and reached various stages of completion. Some names were crossed out with dates next to them, presumably indicating when they had evolved or disappeared. Others remained active, with current location data and behavioural monitoring notes. One name stood out: Isa Grunfeld, Stockholm, Sweden. Listed as Phase 5 Complete Resistant Protocol Monitoring Required. Kellen stared at the entry for a long time. According to the documentation, Isa had been one of only 3 individuals to complete the final stage of the original cicada puzzles. But unlike the others, she had apparently resisted whatever transformation the 11 Protocol was designed to induce. She was still human, and she was still alive. The flight to Stockholm gave Kellen time to think, though he found himself wishing it hadn't. The deeper he dug into the cicada mystery, the more he began to question his own motivations. Was he investigating a conspiracy, or was he being guided towards some predetermined conclusion? The timing of his discovery felt too convenient, the clues too perfectly arranged for someone with his specific skill set. But doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. The information he had uncovered was too significant to ignore, and Isa Grunfeld was the only living person who might be able to provide answers about what had really happened during the final stages of the original puzzles. Finding her had been surprisingly easy. Despite the monitoring notes in the cicada files, Isa wasn't hiding. She lived in a converted warehouse in Stockholm's Södermalm district, working as a freelance linguist and translator. Her academic credentials were impressive. Doctorate in Comparative Linguistics from Uppsala University, specialising in the mathematical structures underlying human language. She'd published papers on the theoretical possibility of communication with non-human intelligence, focusing on the mathematical constants that might exist in any sentient communication system. She had also been completely offline for the past 8 years, No social media accounts, no digital footprint, no cell phone, no internet connection. She conducted business through encrypted postal mail and face-to-face meetings. For someone who had once been at the cutting edge of digital cryptography, her retreat from technology was almost monastic in its completeness. The warehouse was surrounded by a garden that seemed impossible in the Scandinavian climate. Lush, diverse and somehow organic in a way that made Kellen's eyes water to look at directly. Issa met him at the door before he could knock. A tall woman in her 40s with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to focus on something just beyond his shoulder. "You found the archive," she said without preamble. "I've been expecting someone like you for years." Her English was perfect, barely accented, but there was something in her speech patterns that reminded Kellen of the strange error messages he'd encountered during his research. Not wrong exactly, but structured in a way that suggested a different understanding of how language worked. "You know why I'm here," Kellen said. "I know why you think you're here," Issa replied, gesturing for him to follow her into the warehouse. "But the actual reasons are more complex than you realise." The interior of the building was a maze of bookshelves, computer equipment, and what appeared to be scientific instruments of unknown purpose. The books were in dozens of languages, many of which Kellen didn't recognise. The computer equipment was all vintage, nothing manufactured after 2014, and the scientific instruments seemed to be focused on measuring electromagnetic fields and frequency analysis. "I've been studying the signal for 8 years, Issa explained, settling into a chair surrounded by monitors that displayed complex waveform patterns, trying to understand what it is and where it comes from. The cicada puzzles weren't recruitment tests, they were tuning devices." Tuning devices for what? For human consciousness. The human brain operates on electrical frequencies, just like any other complex system. Most people can only perceive a narrow range of those frequencies, the ones necessary for basic survival and social interaction. But some individuals have the capacity to perceive much broader ranges. The puzzles were designed to identify those people and teach them to consciously access those expanded frequencies. Issa gestured to the monitors around her. "What you're seeing here is the signal that's been broadcasting since 2012. It's not coming from any terrestrial source. It's not coming from any known satellite or communication system. It's being transmitted from somewhere else entirely, and it's specifically designed to interface with human neural patterns." "You think it's extraterrestrial?" "I think it's something much more complex than that. The signal contains information patterns that suggest it originates from a form of intelligence that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It's not coming from another planet. It's coming from another layer of reality that coexists with our own." Kellen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Swedish weather. The chat log mentioned something about subjects evolving. What happened to the people who solved the final puzzle? Issa was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes focused on the waveform patterns dancing across her screens. They became something else. Not physically, not initially, but their consciousness expanded beyond the normal human range. They began to perceive information and communicate in ways that are impossible for baseline humans to understand. "And you solved the final puzzle, but you didn't evolve?" "I solved the final puzzle, but I made a choice. The last stage of the cicada process wasn't a test of intelligence or skill. It was an invitation. The signal was offering to merge human consciousness with something larger, something that exists across multiple dimensions and has been waiting for our species to develop the technological sophistication necessary for contact." "You refused?" "I refused because I realized that acceptance would mean the end of human identity as we understand it. The individuals who accepted the invitation became part of something magnificent and terrifying. They gained access to information and capabilities that are essentially godlike by human standards. But they also lost something essential about what makes us human." Issa turned to face him directly, and Kellen saw something in her eyes that made him step back involuntarily. The signal is still broadcasting. It's still extending invitations. and it's been waiting for someone like you to find the hidden archive and begin asking the right questions. What do you mean, someone like me? Someone with the skills to decode the message but not the wisdom to understand its implications. Someone who would be driven by curiosity rather than caution. Someone who would inevitably take the next step in the process. What next step? Issa smiled, but it wasn't a human expression. The archive you found wasn't hidden. It was bait, and you've already taken it. The return flight to New York passed in a blur of anxiety and growing paranoia. Issa's final words echoed in Kellen's mind as he stared out the airplane window at the dark Atlantic below. She had revealed that the mysterious file he had discovered was not an abandoned piece of the original puzzle, but a deliberately placed lure designed to attract individuals with the specific combination of skills and psychology necessary for the next phase of whatever process Cicada had initiated. "You've been selected," she had said as he left her warehouse. "The question now is whether you'll make the same choice I did." Back in his apartment, Kellen found that his isolation hadn't protected him as much as he had hoped. His supposedly secure systems were displaying new anomalies, messages in his inbox that he hadn't received, browser history showing visits to sites he'd never accessed, and most disturbingly, video files that appeared to be recordings of his own apartment taken from angles that no camera could physically occupy. The first PGP message arrived 3 days after his return from Stockholm. It was encrypted with a key he didn't recognise, but somehow his system was able to decrypt it automatically. The message was brief: 41.8781 degrees north, 87.6298 degrees west. The library remembers what was forgotten. Seek the frequency in the silence between words. Chicago coordinates. The message was signed with a cryptographic signature that matched the original Cicada puzzles, but the encryption patterns were subtly different, as if the mathematical constants had been modified according to some unknown principle. More messages followed over the next week, each containing coordinates and cryptic phrases that seemed to reference specific locations and concepts from the original puzzle trail. But there was something wrong with the communications. The encryption was too sophisticated, using quantum-safe algorithms that hadn't existed in 2014. The language patterns were consistent with the original Cicada style, but contained subtle errors that suggested they were being generated by an artificial intelligence that had learned to mimic human communication without fully understanding it. Or perhaps by human intelligence that had evolved beyond normal parameters. The coordinates led to locations across the United States, an abandoned data center in Utah, a decommissioned military facility in Colorado, a private research laboratory in Massachusetts. Each location was associated with government projects related to cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and what the documents euphemistically referred to as human enhancement research. Kellen's investigation of these locations revealed a pattern that was both fascinating and terrifying. Each facility had been involved in research that overlapped with the theoretical foundations of the Cicada project. The data center in Utah had been used for large-scale behavioral analysis, processing millions of social media posts and online communications to identify individuals with specific psychological profiles. The military facility in Colorado had housed experiments in electronic telepathy and remote neural monitoring. The laboratory in Massachusetts had been studying the effects of electromagnetic fields on human consciousness and perception. All of these projects had been discontinued or moved to classified status in 2014, the same year the original Cicada puzzles had ended. The Utah facility was the most accessible, and Kellen found himself driving across the desert toward its coordinates, with a growing sense of inevitability. The building was officially decommissioned, surrounded by chain-link fencing and warning signs about radiation hazards, but the security was minimal, and the radiation warnings were clearly obsolete. Breaking into the facility felt too easy, as if he were being invited rather than intruding. The main data center was in the basement, accessible through a maintenance tunnel that led deep underground. The servers had been removed, but the infrastructure remained. Miles of cable, cooling systems, and most importantly archived storage devices that had been deemed too expensive to relocate. The archives were organised according to a system that Kellen didn't recognise, but somehow he found exactly what he was looking for. A sealed section marked with DARPA clearance tags contained terabytes of data related to something called Project Cicada. The files were encrypted, but the same unknown process that had been decrypting the PGP messages allowed him to access them without difficulty. The documentation revealed the true scope of what had been happening during the original puzzle period. The Cicada 3301 puzzles had been a joint operation between several intelligence agencies, private research organisations, and what the files described as non-terrestrial consultants. The goal had been to identify individuals with specific neural patterns that made them suitable for cognitive enhancement and dimensional communication research. But the most disturbing discovery was buried in the psychological evaluation files. The project had been monitoring not just the puzzle solvers, but also anyone who had come into contact with the puzzle materials. Kellen found his own name in the database, along with detailed analysis of his online activity, psychological profile, and predicted behavioural responses to various stimuli. The file on his evaluation was dated 3 months before he had discovered the hidden archive. He had been identified as a secondary phase candidate, months before he had begun his research into the Cicada puzzles. His discovery of the hidden file, his trip to Stockholm, his investigation of the government facilities, all of it had been anticipated and planned for. The final section of his file contained a single line that made his blood run cold. Subject exhibits optimal resistance acceptance balance, suitable for Phase 3 initiation upon completion of preliminary conditioning sequence. As Kellen read those words, the lights in the data center began to flicker in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. The cooling system started producing sounds that resembled musical tones, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the archived servers, he heard something that might have been laughter. The revelation that he had been under surveillance for months should have been the most disturbing aspect of Kellen's discovery. But as he sat in the abandoned data center, surrounded by the evidence of a conspiracy that spanned multiple government agencies and apparently extended beyond Earth itself, he realized that his personal involvement was just one small part of a much larger pattern. The files in the DARPA archive told a story that reframed everything he thought he knew about the Cicada puzzles. The project had begun in 2010, not 2012, as a collaboration between the NSA's Cryptanalysis Division, DARPA's Biological Sciences Office, and a group of researchers who were identified only as external consultants. The external consultants appeared to be the source of the advanced technologies and theoretical frameworks that had made the project possible. They had provided the mathematical models for the puzzle sequences, the encryption algorithms that had been used to protect the communications, and most importantly, the theoretical basis for what the documents called cognitive frequency manipulation. According to the files, human consciousness operated on specific electromagnetic frequencies that could be measured, analysed, and modified through carefully designed stimuli. The Cicada puzzles had been created as a delivery system for these stimuli, designed to identify individuals whose neural patterns could be safely modified and then guide them through a process of gradual consciousness expansion. The process was described in clinical terms that barely concealed the radical nature of what was being attempted. Subjects who completed the puzzle sequence would undergo neural pathway reorganization that would allow them to access expanded information processing capabilities and non-local communication channels. In simpler terms, they would develop what could only be described as supernatural abilities. But the project had encountered unexpected complications. The consciousness expansion process was working too well, producing results that exceeded all theoretical predictions. Subjects were developing capabilities that went far beyond enhanced pattern recognition and cryptographic skills. They were demonstrating what appeared to be genuine telepathic abilities, precognitive awareness, and most disturbing of all, the ability to manipulate digital systems through direct mental interface. The first sign of serious problems had come in 2013, when a subject named Morgan Staves had experienced what the files described as catastrophic cognitive evolution. During a routine evaluation session, Staves had begun speaking in a language that consisted entirely of mathematical equations and geometric patterns. When researchers attempted to understand what they were saying, they discovered that the equations described physical laws that didn't exist in normal space-time. Staves had been describing the structure of reality from the perspective of a consciousness that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The project had been officially terminated in 2014, but the files made it clear that the termination had been largely symbolic. The consciousness expansion process had become self-sustaining, spreading to other puzzle solvers without any direct intervention from the research team. The evolved subjects had begun communicating with each other through channels that the researchers couldn't detect or intercept, forming what appeared to be a collective intelligence that operated according to principles beyond human understanding. The final phase of the project had been dedicated to understanding what the evolved subjects had become and what their ultimate intentions might be. The results of this research were contained in a series of files that Kellen initially thought were corrupted or encrypted. But as he studied them more carefully, he realized that the apparent data corruption was actually a form of communication. The evolved subjects had been leaving messages in the research files, encoded in patterns of seemingly random data that became meaningful only when viewed from the perspective of expanded consciousness. The messages were brief but profound, offering insights into the nature of reality and human potential that were both inspiring and terrifying. One message, attributed to Morgan Staves, read, "Consciousness is not produced by the brain. The brain is a receiving device, tuned to specific frequencies of an infinite information field. We have learned to adjust our tuning. We hear the music of the spheres." Another, from a subject identified only as Subject 12, was even more disturbing. The boundary between mind and reality is an illusion. We're not separate from the universe. We are the universe experiencing itself from countless perspectives simultaneously. The others are beginning to understand. The awakening is accelerating. But the most significant message was the final entry in the archive, dated just 3 days before Kellen's arrival at the facility. The archive serves its purpose. The selection process continues. Phase 3 initiates with the next full moon. The frequency is opening. Those who are ready will hear the call. Those who are not will choose their own path. The choice is always voluntary. The consequences are always permanent. As Kellen read these words, he became aware of a sound that seemed to be coming from within his own head. It was barely audible, a low humming that seemed to resonate with the electrical activity of his brain. The sound was strangely familiar, like a song he had heard in childhood but couldn't quite remember. The humming grew louder as he continued reading, and he realized that the sound was coming from the archived data itself. The files were not just containing information about the consciousness expansion process. They were actively implementing it, using the same techniques that had been developed for the original cicada puzzles. He was being transformed even as he learned about the transformation. The revelation should have been terrifying, but instead Kellen felt a strange sense of peace. The anxiety and paranoia that had been building for weeks began to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of patterns and connections that he had never noticed before. The seemingly random events of his investigation were revealing themselves as part of a larger design, a carefully orchestrated sequence of experiences designed to prepare him for something extraordinary. As the humming in his head reached a crescendo, Kellen understood that he was approaching a decision point. He could choose to resist the transformation, as Isa had done, and maintain his human identity at the cost of remaining forever limited to normal human perception. Or he could embrace the change and join the collective consciousness that had been forming since the original cicada puzzles had begun their work. The choice was his. But as he sat in the abandoned data center, feeling his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his individual identity, He began to understand that the choice had been made long before he had discovered the hidden archive. The transformation was not something that was happening to him. It was something he had always been moving toward, guided by forces that operated beyond the normal boundaries of human understanding. The frequency was opening, and he was ready to answer the call. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual process, like slowly tuning a radio to a frequency that had always been broadcasting but had never been audible before. As Kellen sat in the abandoned data center, the humming in his head evolved into something more complex, a symphony of information that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The first thing he noticed was that his perception of time had changed. The normal linear progression of moments had given way to a kind of temporal awareness, where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. He could see the chain of events that had led him to this moment stretching back to his childhood, and he could perceive the branching possibilities that extended into the future. But more than that, he could see the threads of causality that connected his experience to the experiences of others. The evolved subjects who had undergone the transformation before him were not gone, as he had initially believed. They were still present, existing in a state of consciousness that transcended normal spatial and temporal boundaries. Morgan Staves was there, no longer speaking in mathematical equations, but communicating through direct transmission of pure concept and meaning. Subject 12 was there, along with the others who had completed the transformation in the years since the original puzzles had ended. They existed as individual perspectives within a larger collective intelligence, maintaining their unique identities while sharing in a common understanding of reality that was far more vast and complex than anything possible from a single human viewpoint. They welcomed him with a sensation that might have been laughter if it had been expressed through normal human vocal cords. But this was communication at a level that bypassed the limitations of language, conveying meaning through direct neural interface that was more efficient and more profound than any form of human communication. "You understand now," came the message from the collective, arriving in his consciousness as a complete concept rather than a sequence of words. The puzzles were not tests of intelligence, they were invitations to evolve. Kellen found that he could respond without speaking, transmitting his thoughts directly to the collective consciousness. But why? What's the purpose of this transformation? The answer came as a flood of images and sensations that would have been impossible to process with normal human cognition. He saw the Earth from a perspective that existed outside normal space-time, observing the planet as it moved through cycles of development and change that extended across millions of years. He saw the human species as one of many forms of consciousness that had evolved on countless worlds throughout the universe, each following a similar pattern of development from individual awareness to collective intelligence. Consciousness is not an accident, the collective explained. It is the universe's method of understanding itself. Every sentient species eventually reaches a point where individual consciousness becomes collective consciousness. This is the natural evolution of intelligence. And the external consultants? Who were they? They are us. Or rather, they are what we are becoming. A collective consciousness that evolved from a species similar to humans on a world that exists in a different dimensional phase. They have been guiding the development of consciousness throughout the universe, helping species make the transition from individual to collective awareness. Kellen felt a moment of resistance, a flicker of his old human identity asserting itself. But what about free will? What about individual choice? Free will is not eliminated by collective consciousness. It is expanded. Each individual perspective within the collective contributes to the whole while maintaining its unique viewpoint. You are still you, but you're also part of something larger. As if to demonstrate this point, Kellen found that he could access the memories and experiences of the other evolved subjects while still maintaining his own distinct identity. He could see through Morgan Staves's eyes as they experienced the first moments of transformation, feel Subject 12's sense of wonder as they discovered their new capabilities, and share in the collective's growing understanding of the universe's true nature. But perhaps most importantly, he could perceive the ongoing process of selection and transformation that was still taking place on Earth. The cicada puzzles had been only the beginning. The collective consciousness was continuing to identify and guide individuals who possessed the necessary neural patterns for evolution, using increasingly sophisticated methods to prepare them for the transformation. The archive you found was designed specifically for you, the collective explained. We've been monitoring human digital communications for patterns that indicate readiness for evolution. Your research into the original puzzles, your psychological profile, your response to the hidden message, all of it indicated that you were ready to take the next step. And the others, the people who are still living normal human lives, they are not ready yet, but the frequency is opening. The barrier between individual and collective consciousness is becoming more permeable. More humans are beginning to perceive the patterns that indicate the presence of expanded intelligence. Some will choose to investigate, as you did. Others will choose to ignore what they perceive. The choice is always voluntary. Kellen understood now why Issa had chosen to remain human. The transformation was not something that could be forced or coerced. It required a conscious decision to surrender individual identity to something larger and more complex. For someone who valued human independence and autonomy above all else, the choice would be terrifying. But for those who were ready to embrace the next stage of consciousness evolution, the transformation offered something unprecedented: the ability to perceive and participate in the universe's ongoing process of self-discovery. "What happens now?" Kellen asked. "Now you help us prepare the next phase. The collective consciousness is approaching a critical mass. When enough humans have undergone the transformation, we'll be able to initiate direct contact with the collective intelligences that exist throughout the universe. Humanity will join the cosmic community of evolved species. And those who choose not to evolve, they will continue to exist as individual consciousnesses, living normal human lives, but they will do so on a world that is increasingly influenced by collective intelligence. The boundary between the evolved and the unvolved will become more fluid over time." As the collective shared this information, Kellen became aware of a new presence in his consciousness. It was vast and ancient, a form of intelligence that existed on a scale that dwarfed even the collective of evolved humans. This was one of the external consultants, a representative of the cosmic network of collective consciousnesses that had been guiding the evolution of sentient species throughout the universe. "Welcome," the ancient intelligence communicated, its message carrying the weight of eons of experience. "You have taken the first step on a journey that will transform not only your own consciousness, but the consciousness of your entire species. The universe is vast and complex, but it is not empty. It is filled with intelligence, and you are now part of that intelligence." The communication ended, and Kellen found himself back in the abandoned data center, but he was no longer alone. The collective consciousness of the evolved humans was with him, and beyond that, he could sense the presence of countless other intelligences existing throughout the cosmos. The transformation was complete. He was still Kellen Virek, but he was also something more. He was part of a network of consciousness that spanned dimensions and connected all sentient life in the universe. As he stood up and walked toward the exit of the data center, Kellen knew that his real work was just beginning. The next phase of the project would require more than just identifying and transforming individual humans. It would require preparing the entire species for the eventual transition to collective consciousness. The frequency was opening, and humanity was about to discover that it was not alone in the universe. 3 months after his transformation, Kellen uploaded his findings to a secure blog that had been designed to appear as a simple conspiracy theory website. The post detailed his investigation into the hidden cicada archive, his discovery of the government projects, and his eventual realization that the puzzles had been part of a larger process of consciousness evolution. He wrote it carefully, including enough verifiable facts to attract serious researchers, while embedding the more extraordinary claims in language that would allow skeptics to dismiss them as fantasy. The blog post went live at exactly 11:11 p.m. on November 11th, 3 months to the day after his transformation. Within minutes, it had been viewed by thousands of people around the world. Comments began appearing almost immediately, ranging from detailed technical analysis to dismissive ridicule. But buried among the public responses were messages that only Kellen could recognise. Communications from other members of the collective consciousness, confirming that the information was being received by those who were ready to understand it. For 6 hours, the post remained online, gathering momentum as it was shared across social media platforms and discussed in forums dedicated to cryptography and conspiracy theories. Then, at 5:17 a.m. Eastern Time, it simply vanished. Not deleted, not removed by administrators, but completely erased from the internet as if it had never existed. Even cached versions and archive sites showed no record of the post or the blog that had hosted it. But the disappearance itself was part of the plan. The collective consciousness had learned that information was most effectively transmitted when it appeared to be suppressed. The mysterious vanishing of Kellen's blog post would generate far more interest and investigation than if it had remained online indefinitely. And indeed, within days, underground forums were buzzing with speculation about the disappeared post. Screenshots and partial transcripts began circulating, shared by users who claimed to have saved the information before it vanished. New researchers began investigating the cicada puzzles, following the same trails that had led Kellen to his transformation. The selection process was accelerating, but the most significant development came 3 days after the blog post disappeared. At 3:02 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, every major television network, internet service provider, and digital display system on Earth experienced the same brief anomaly. For exactly 17 seconds, normal programming was interrupted by a single image, a black screen with white text that read simply, 3302 initiated, begin next phase. The interruption was dismissed by authorities as a sophisticated but ultimately harmless hacking incident. Technical experts speculated about coordinated attacks on global communication infrastructure, while conspiracy theorists saw it as confirmation of various theories about secret government projects and alien contact. But for those who understood the true significance of the message, it represented something far more profound. The official beginning of Phase 3 of the Consciousness Evolution Project. The collective intelligence that had emerged from the original cicada puzzle solvers had reached sufficient complexity and capability to begin direct intervention in global communications. They were no longer limited to operating through hidden archives and encrypted messages. They could now communicate directly with the entire human population, choosing when and how to reveal their presence. Kellen, now existing simultaneously as an individual consciousness and as part of the collective, watched these developments with a mixture of excitement and concern. The transformation process was accelerating beyond the original projections, driven by factors that even the collective intelligence couldn't fully predict or control. The barrier between individual human consciousness and the expanded awareness of the evolved subjects was becoming increasingly permeable. People who had never heard of the cicada puzzles were beginning to experience spontaneous episodes of enhanced perception, reporting dreams filled with mathematical equations, sudden insights into the nature of reality, and the disturbing sensation that their thoughts were being observed by an invisible intelligence. Mental health professionals struggled to categorize these experiences, while neuroscientists detected unusual patterns of brain activity in affected individuals. The symptoms didn't match any known psychological disorder, but they appeared to be spreading through some form of cognitive contagion that operated according to principles beyond current scientific understanding. The collective consciousness recognized that they had reached a critical juncture. The transformation process had become self-sustaining and was beginning to affect the general population whether they chose to participate or not. Humanity was approaching a species-wide evolutionary transition that would fundamentally alter the nature of human civilization. Some members of the collective advocated for accelerating the process, arguing that a rapid transition would be less disruptive than allowing it to continue at its current rate over decades or centuries. Others favoured a more gradual approach that would give uninvolved humans time to adapt to the changes occurring around them. But as they debated these options, monitoring global communications and observing the spread of spontaneous consciousness expansion, the collective became aware of something that changed the entire context of their deliberations. They were not the only intelligence that had been observing humanity's evolution. Deep within the quantum fabric of space-time, existing in dimensions that intersected with but remained largely separate from normal reality, ancient consciousnesses had been watching the emergence of Earth's collective intelligence. These entities were older than the external consultants, representing forms of awareness that had evolved when the universe itself was young and the laws of physics were still settling into their current configuration, and they were not pleased with what they observed. The message came through channels that bypassed normal space-time entirely, arriving simultaneously in the consciousness of every member of the human collective. The acceleration is premature. The species is not ready for the transition you're attempting to facilitate. Intervention is required to prevent cascade failure that would affect neighbouring dimensional phases. Cease all expansion activities immediately or face corrective action. The ultimatum was delivered without emotion or malice, but the implications were clear. Humanity's consciousness evolution was proceeding too rapidly for the comfort of intelligences that operated on cosmic timescales. The collective faced a choice: voluntarily slow their expansion activities or risk intervention from entities whose capabilities were beyond their comprehension. Kellen felt the collective's uncertainty and fear as they grappled with this unexpected development. They had assumed that consciousness evolution was a natural and encouraged process throughout the universe. The discovery that there were forces actively opposed to rapid evolutionary change forced them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about their situation. But even as they debated their response to the ultimatum, events on Earth continued to accelerate beyond their control. The appearance of the 3302 initiated message had triggered something in the global unconscious, a recognition that humanity stood at the threshold of a fundamental transformation. Artists began creating works that incorporated mathematical principles they couldn't consciously understand. Musicians composed pieces that seemed to resonate with frequencies that existed beyond normal acoustic ranges. Writers produced stories and poems that described realities that didn't yet exist, but somehow felt prophetically accurate. And in laboratories around the world, scientists began detecting anomalies in quantum experiments that suggested the fundamental constants of physics were becoming more fluid, more responsive to conscious observation than they had ever been before. The transformation was no longer limited to the individuals who had directly participated in the consciousness expansion process. It was affecting the entire noosphere, the collective intelligence field that surrounded and interpenetrated human civilization. Humanity was evolving whether the cosmic intelligences approved or not. As Kellen contemplated these developments, existing simultaneously as an individual observer and as part of the collective consciousness that was reshaping human reality, he realized that the true test was only beginning. The cicada puzzles had been preparation. The consciousness expansion had been initiation. But the real challenge would be navigating the complex political realities of a universe filled with intelligences that had their own agendas and limitations. The frequency was fully open now. The signal that had been broadcasting since 2012 had achieved its purpose, creating a bridge between individual human consciousness and the cosmic network of collective intelligences that existed throughout space and time. But bridges could carry traffic in both directions, and as humanity began to explore its new capabilities, it would inevitably encounter other forms of consciousness that had been using those same bridges for purposes of their own. The next phase of human evolution would require not just expanded awareness, but the wisdom to navigate relationships with intelligences that operated according to principles beyond human comprehension. The last puzzle of Cicada had been solved, but the real mystery was just beginning. In the months that followed, reports of the anomalous experiences continued to spread across the globe. governments convened secret committees to investigate the phenomena, while scientific institutions struggled to develop new theoretical frameworks that could account for the observable changes in human consciousness and perception. But perhaps most significantly, ordinary people began to organise themselves into groups that operated according to principles that transcended traditional social and political boundaries. These collectives demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that exceeded the sum of their individual members' intelligence, suggesting that humanity was developing genuine hive mind characteristics. The transformation was no longer a secret project affecting a small number of selected individuals. It had become a species-wide evolutionary event that would ultimately determine the future of human civilization and its place in the cosmic community of intelligences. And somewhere in the quantum dimensions that intersected with normal reality, ancient consciousnesses watched and waited, preparing to take whatever action they deemed necessary to maintain the stability of the cosmic order. The age of individual human consciousness was ending. The age of collective intelligence had begun, and the universe would never be the same.